time, and He sets the bounds of their habitation. This God is our God. None can stay His hand, Nebuchadnezzar says, or say to Him, "What doest thou?" And this power, this might of this God is something that even the unregenerate, unbelieving, who've never even seen the Scriptures or heard the Word of God can recognize about this God. Romans 1 says that the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood in the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. This God is our God. But when the psalmist wants to talk about the greatness of God, great is the Lord, he has something else especially in mind. And he sees the greatness and the might, the power of God in a very unique way. Where does he see it? In this psalm, he sees the power of God in the safety and the salvation of the church. You read this psalm, and it's a psalm of God's presence in the church and of God's work in the church. A song of rejoicing over the way that God has preserved and cares for His people. That begins already in verse 1. The psalmist says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised." Where? In the city of our God, in the mountain of His holiness. And then he talks about the greatness and the beauty and the protection of the church. In verse 2, he speaks of the beautiful situation of the church. In verse 3, the presence of God. God is known in her palaces. The safety of the church because of the presence of God. God is known in her palaces for a refuge. In verse 9 he says, "We have thought of Thy loving kindness in the midst of Thy temple." In verse 10 he says, "According to Thy name, O God, so is Thy praise unto the ends of the earth." And so he has in mind God's revelation in His presence in the church and with the people of God in the church. When he speaks of Zion here and speaks of Jerusalem here, we understand that that's of typical significance. Yes, Jerusalem was important in the Old Testament. God called the people to come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the place where the temple was. It was the place of worship. It was the place of the kingship and the priesthood. It was a place where God's people gathered together to worship and to see the promises in the signs that pointed ahead to the coming Messiah. But God today, in a sense, has sent His people away from Jerusalem, because Christ has come as the fulfillment of these things. But Jerusalem then represents the church, and when we speak of God being in her palaces and in the midst of her, we have to think of God's presence in the church and the power of God in saving His church. And this is where we see especially the greatness of God. This God who is with His people, this God who is in the church, this God who has saved His church, this God who gathers His church, this God is our God. We can see that on a very small scale from our own experience in this church and in your lives in the gathering of the church as God has worked that by the gospel. This God, the God who has called us by the Spirit and Word and gathered us together as a church, this God is our God. He's been good to us. Yes, there's pain and trouble in the past and even in the life and the history of the church, but God, this God, has been good to us, and this God has gathered us together. And even on a larger scale, look at the history of the world and look at what God has done. In eternity even. In eternity, God chose a people to be His people in Jesus Christ. He determined the total number of the elect. He determined who each of those would be and what their place would be in the church and in history. He gave His Son to be the husband to his bride and body, the church. He sent His Son to redeem them, to pay the price, to ransom them. He did that on the cross. This God, the psalmist even has that in mind in the text from an Old Testament point of view. You look at verse 9, he says, we have thought of Thy loving kindness. In the end of verse 10, he says, Thy right hand is full of righteousness. What do you think of when you think of the loving kindness of God and the righteousness of God? Well, those are concepts in the Bible that should point us directly to Christ and the cross and what God did there. The loving kindness of God is His steadfast covenant love revealed in the Old Testament in the promises of the covenant. And especially the promise of the coming Christ, the seed who would be born of the line of Abraham and the line of David. What's the right hand of the righteousness of God? It's the justice of God. His right hand is His right hand of power. And so His right hand of righteousness is the revelation of His justice in His wrath against sin. And God in His loving kindness places that hand of wrath on His Son. And there's especially what God has done for the church. This God who has redeemed His people through His Son. This God is our God. And He continues to work today. Jesus Christ says to the church, I give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. The gates of hell, He says, shall not prevail against my church as I build it. He says in John chapter 10, they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. You see, this God who has given His Son to redeem the church remains faithful to that church that He's bought with His blood till every one has been gathered in. And that's the revelation of the power and the greatness of God that the psalmist has in mind as he thinks about God. He thinks of the safety of the church. He thinks of the ways that God has set up bulwarks in the church. He says in verse 11, let Mount Zion rejoice, let the daughters of Judah be glad because of Thy judgments. Verse 12, walk about Zion, go round about her, tell the towers thereof, mark ye well her bulwarks, consider her palaces, that ye may tell it to the generation following. The idea is this, that God has set up a wall of safety around the church. And you think of what that wall of safety is and the ways that God guards and protects the church today. He does it by giving faithful office bearers, by giving to the church the truth, which will protect her over against the errors of the world and of the departing church. And God has put these walls of protection there. He's given to us a heritage. Mark these things and consider the goodness of God to His church. So this is who this God is. But then, second, we want to notice from the text what He is. What He is to us. And the psalmist says two things there. First he says, this God is our God. This God is our God. Now there's something very remarkable and even bold about such a confession. How can we make such a confession about God, that He is our God? How can we make such a confession when we prove ourselves again and again to be unprofitable servants of His? There are some who would say, well, you can't say that. You can't say that with definiteness. This God is our God. You can say He's the God of Christians more generally, but don't be so sure as to say He is our God. We recognize His power, they say. We recognize who He is. We're humbled by the fact that we know who He is, but let's not say He's our God. But the psalmist says it. He takes this confession on his lips. This God is our God. And there's something very personable about us, very personal about that. He's not the abstract God of believers. He's not the God of history. He's not the God of providence. He's not the God of creation, but He's our God. The psalmist sees the importance of his own living connection and relationship to this God. There's a personal thing that he expresses, and that comes out on two levels. Notice, first of all, that he says this is our God. And he's speaking as a part of the church of God when he says that. Not just as an individual, but our personal relationship to God begins and is a part of our relationship in the body of believers. And we must be a part of that body of believers in the church through the means of grace. We know the presence of God. The psalmist says in verse 9, we thought of Thy loving kindness, O God, in the midst of Thy temple. And the idea is that with fellow believers, he recognizes that this God is his God. But also, it is personal. It's about himself. The one who says our God says my God, and he realizes that he himself stands in relation to God. So that he is like Enoch, who walked with God day by day, or like the psalmist who says, I've put the Lord always before me, or who says, Thou shalt guide me with Thy counsel and afterward lead me to glory. The psalmist understands that God's hand holds him, and that he lives and must live with this God himself. So this God is our God. The greatness of God. And then this beautiful confession, this great God is my God. But more, the psalmist says He's also our guide.